I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from across the battlefront, discuss recent developments in drone warfare and its implication for armies around the world, and we analyse a new report on torture in the occupied regions of Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of August. 1 year and 159 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols, senior tech reporter Gareth Caulfield, foreign reporter Verity Bowman, and former tank commander and Telegraph columnist Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Just a note from us, this episode contains descriptions of graphic violence and cruelty. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. So Russia has continued its policy of attacking grain infrastructure in the wake of withdrawing from the Black Sea deal. So last night, Russian drones attacked and damaged ports and grain storage facilities in Odessa, so on the southwest coast of Ukraine here, and also caused serious damage at the Ukrainian port of Izmail on the Danube River. That was according to Reuters, although there is very dramatic social media footage you can see of that blast. Now, that facility in Izmail on the Danube, we're now 100 k's southwest of Odessa, in that bit of Ukraine that sits south of Moldova and is literally across the river from Romania, a NATO member, don't forget. Now, the port has served as the main alternative route out of Ukraine for grain exports since Russia reintroduced its de facto blockade of the Black Sea ports in mid-July. Now, in response, Klaus Iohannis, who's Romania's president, said in a tweet this morning, Russia's continued attacks against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure on the Danube in the proximity of Romania are unacceptable. These are war crimes, and they further affect Ukraine's capacity to transfer their food products towards those in need in the world. Okay, now, then in a completely reasonable statement yesterday from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, he said Moscow is ready to return without delay to the grain deal, but after the conditions for Russia are fulfilled. I mean, look, you can understand his frustration. There's poor old Russia desperately trying to do the right thing over the grain issue, but stymied at every turn by nasty old Ukraine, who forced it out of the grain deal and forced it to fire missiles at the silos. I mean, come on, look, this is yet again the language of an abuser. Everything will be fine as long as you do what I want. Why are you making me hurt you? I mean, I'm sorry if these words echo with any listeners. I don't mean in any way to make light of issues such as abuse, but we need to be clear about what this Russian system is and who these people are. Now, there were no reported casualties in these attacks, but it does once again bring attention to the issue of escalation, especially in light of the recent drone attacks in Russia. I think there's two things we need to think about here. First, having failed to knock Ukraine out of the war with general attacks on civilians and the campaign against energy infrastructure last winter, Russia is now going for the grain, which is an attack not just on Ukraine, but obviously has global implications. So they're attempting to wage total war on Ukraine, knowing the collateral impact their actions will have on some of the poorest countries in the world. That is escalation. Secondly, Russian forces, with an established track record of not caring about where their missiles go, have fired rockets with, I'd estimate, a better than average chance of hitting a NATO country. So if they consider that just part of warfare and in no way escalatory, I don't think we should worry about Ukraine taking the fight to the Kremlin. On that last point, so in response to Ukraine's alleged recent drone attacks on Moscow, a US State Department spokesman yesterday said, "We neither encourage nor enable strikes outside Ukraine's borders, but as we have said many times, it is up to Ukraine to decide how to conduct this war. It has been Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that has been targeted over and over. Ukrainian citizens have been murdered in this war." Okay, elsewhere last night, more than 10 Russian drones were shot down during overnight attacks on Kyiv and elsewhere. This is from Ukrainian officials. So Sergei Popko, who's the head of Kyiv's city military administration, said groups of drones entered Kyiv simultaneously from several directions. All air targets were detected and destroyed in time by air defense. He said it was the Iranian-made 136 Shahed 136, 131 drones. Debris hit many different areas of the city. Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, he said the attack had caused damage in multiple districts, but said that no one killed or wounded. And then there's a report today in the Kyiv Independent that's quoting Ukraine's Southern Operational Command that says Russian jets fired missiles on Monday at Snake Island. And that's the third such attack on Snake Island this month. No casualties reported there. You may remember President Zelensky visited Snake Island earlier this month to mark 500 days of Russia's full-scale war. And then finally, Putin's trapped and compliant man in Belarus, who's cosplaying at being the leader of an independent country, the so-called President Alexander Lukashenko, has claimed Wagner fighters would have smashed up Polish cities without his intervention. So this comes from Belarusian state news agency Belta. No more appropriate term than that. Lukashenko said Poland should pray that we're holding on to Wagner and providing for them. Without us, they would have seeped through and smashed up Rzeszów and Warsaw in no small way. So they shouldn't reproach me. They should say thank you. Great. Now, that obviously comes amid growing tension between Poland and Belarus. Poland recently shifted more than 1,000 troops to its border after Wagner moved in. And yesterday, after Lukashenko's comments about that I mentioned earlier, Poland's defense ministry said it was sending additional forces and resources, including combat helicopters, to the border region after an alleged incursion by two Belarusian helicopters, Mi-24 and Mi-8. Now, whether or not it was, Belarus have denied it, whether or not it was Belarusian, whether or not it happened, Poland say it did, but Belarus say it didn't. I know who I believe. Whether it was Belarus Air Force or Wagner, we don't know. Warsaw summoned Belarus's chargé d'affaires to provide an explanation, and Minsk denied it ever happened. The defense ministry said Poland had earlier accepted no incursion took place, and then, and this is a great quote, changed their narrative in the evening, apparently after consulting with their overseas masters, which I think is particularly fine language and makes it clear exactly how independent Belarus is these days, in case there was any lingering doubt. But I'll pause there, David.
Thank you very much for that, Dom, and we'll come back to you later, I'm sure. Can I go to Verity Bowman? Verity, thanks so much for your time and for joining us. There's a new report out on torture committed by Russian troops in Ukraine from a team of war crime investigators. You've been reading this and you've written it up for The Telegraph. What does it say?
Well, so the overarching finding from the report is that almost 50% of people who were held in these notorious Kherson detention centres during the occupation of the area were subject to torture, and that includes genital mutilation. So what they've found so far are 35 confirmed torture chambers and in Ukraine south, and this was occupied between March and November 2022. These findings are now being investigated by Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General, and early findings indicate that the victims, half of which are believed to be civilians, were suffocated, waterboarded, severely beaten or threatened with rape by Russian soldiers and collaborators. And they've already collected the testimony of some 36 people who witnessed or were subject to genital electrocution. Other people also mentioned threats of genital mutilation, and at least one victim was forced to witness the rape of another detainee by a foreign object.
Now the report's out, what do other lawyers and investigators who've also read it, what do they make of the findings?
So the main person I've been speaking to about this is the human rights barrister Wayne Jordash KC, who is helping coordinate the investigations alongside the OPG. And what he said that really stood out to me, it was that the actions of the Russian military in Kherson detention centres basically amount to genocide. He said that it was consistent with a cynical and calculated plan to humiliate and terrorise millions of Ukrainian citizens in order to subjugate them to the will of the Kremlin. Mr. Jordash and a few other members of the team said it was likely that even now the true extent of the torture could be much worse than we actually believe, because so much is left to be investigated.
Could we talk a little bit about the victims in this? Who were the people detained and why were they taken?
Well, it was such a wide range of people being taken at this point. So the first people, would be a little bit more what you'd expect. It'd be those with any connection to the Ukrainian state or Ukrainian civil society. So those are the people that are journalists, activists, teachers, civil servants, and they were both male and female. But what we have found are reports emerging of locals being imprisoned for as little as having, maybe pro-Ukrainian content of their phones on social media. But in some cases, they were even detained for no charge at all. And what the OPG has found is that over half of those detained in these facilities were identified as civilians.
There's certainly a sense in this report and in your article that this violence, torture and the cruelty shown by Russian troops was both systematic and systemic. To what extent would you agree with that?
I mean, I definitely agree with this. These detention centres were not set up accidentally, and they certainly targeted Ukrainians on a large scale, for many actions deemed a minor crime or for nothing at all. It isn't just a handful of detention centres we're talking about, but already 35 in such a smaller region of Ukraine. There are many signs of torture investigations who found numerous detention centres across the region, and this really demonstrates the sheer scale of the system Russia had in place. In one of the main findings, there were 17 cases of genital electrocution that were linked to just one senior Russian commander alone. And the experts we've spoken to have confirmed that the cruelty was systematic. Mr. Jordash, who is very experienced, he's practiced for over 20 years in international human rights and humanitarian law fields, and he said that the level of calculation and cynicism by Russia was something that he'd actually never seen before.
Verity, is there anything more you'd like to add to your reporting on this?
I think the main thing I would like to say is that we're in such early days of finding out what actually happened in these detention centres, and already the evidence is so overwhelming. But we've got a lot left to find out, and I think that these investigations will be going on for a very long time.
Verity, thank you so much for joining. Well, thank you, Dom and Verity. Can I go to Gareth Caulfield and Hamish Breton-Gordon? Last week, we spoke about the drone war in Ukraine. We interviewed Svetlana Moranets, friend of the podcast, who's actually currently in Ukraine at the moment. Svetlana is a journalist at The Spectator. She talked to us about some of the things she'd seen in Ukraine, going to sort of drone fight club with the Ukrainian army training recruits to fly drones. You've been writing and looking at the use of drones in the British Army, and it's quite an interesting story, and I think shows a lot about how the war in Ukraine has changed how other militaries are thinking about fighting their wars. So Gareth, can I go to you first? Could you just give the outline of the story you wrote?
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So the story I broke actually on Monday, was that an 8th British Army Watchkeeper drone has crashed. Now that's in itself quite a revealing little headline there, because the army has 54 of these Watchkeeper drones, and these were intended as a sort of battlefield eye in the sky, aerial surveillance for the Royal Artillery. However, the Watchkeeper drone programme has been quite troubled. Now, 8 of these things have crashed. None of them have crashed in a war zone. Certainly none of them has crashed as a result of enemy action. All of these are due to a variety of factors. Some of them in the early days were down to poor design. Some of them were down to over-ambitious trials, flying them into bad weather. And the crash of that 8th drone has kind of shed fresh light on what is now a £1.35 billion defence procurement exercise. We're spending great sums of money buying these drones, which are specified in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, for the sorts of wars that we were currently fighting at the time. Not wars as they are fought today, however. Now, we have seen in the Ukraine context, of course, that there's extensive use being made of small drones. Yeah. And when I say small drones, I mean sort of handheld things going up to the size of DJI Mavics and Phantoms, perhaps, the sort of larger quadcopters, octocopters, and so on. Watchkeeper, however, is the size of a light aeroplane. And for those of you listening who are aviation-minded, maybe the size of a little Cessna, the sort of thing that a trainee pilot would learn to operate first in his career. So we have the situation where there's this very expensive program being continued. Many of these aircraft have crashed in British service. None of them, I think, apart from 4, have ever been deployed to a war zone, let alone achieved any useful operational effect. And the question is now being raised in Parliament and Westminster whether this is a wise use of public money. We looked at the Ukrainian experience. We see extensive use of small light drones, which cost a few hundreds to a few thousands of pounds. And then we look at Watchkeeper, which costs something like 5.2 million per airframe. And we say, is this the way that we should be continuing? Is this a wise use of British public resources? And are we adequately learning the lessons our Ukrainian allies have taught us?
Well, thanks very much, Gareth, for that introduction. Hamish, can I bring you in there? What would you like to add to that? And what do you think you've learnt as a former military man yourself from the Ukrainian use of drones?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I don't want to sound like sort of jack of all trades. I know I comment on tanks and chemical and nuclear warfare on this pod and in the paper, but I feel I have a bit of responsibility behind this, because one of my last jobs in the military, I was the assistant chief ISTAR, Intelligence, Surveillance, Target Acquisition and Reconnaissance, the sort of departments who look after drones in Afghanistan back in 2008. And just a tiny bit of background. When I started off in 2008, actually we were using a Nimrod aircraft. This is something, military derivative of a Comet jet, about the size of a 737 with 12 people on it. It had a camera, I think it was called an MX-15, which was basically doing what these handheld drones do now. Take pictures of what you're looking at, the targets you're looking at. But then things obviously have shrunk down. But also at the time, we had the precursor to Watchkeeper, something called Hermes 450, which was an off-the-peg Israeli drone, which looks remarkably similar to Watchkeeper. And then Watchkeeper was bought in. Ostensibly, it has a camera on it. There were plans to weaponize it. And without the history of drones, obviously the RAF have something called a Reaper drone, which is slightly bigger than a Watchkeeper, flies slightly higher, and is armed with Hellfire and other bits and pieces. And I think Gareth's piece really frames very well perhaps some rivalry between the Army and the RAF, why we then got two fairly similar drones. But the key thing to me was, of course, Watchkeeper back in 2008-9, when it was being conceived, was conceived for counterinsurgency in the clear skies over Afghanistan and Iraq. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda had no air defense to talk about. So these things can cruise around, and as we've heard, the size of a Cessna, but with cameras taking pictures. What I then had a time with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurd military, in the fight with ISIS. And that's the first time we saw these small drones that ISIS were using to drop hand grenades and other bits and pieces. And it struck me how effective they were, because we only had small arms ammunition. We couldn't take them down. So it's a classic military procurement conundrum. And this is not unique to the British military. Something conceived in 2008, wind forward to 2023, when we're now seeing that drones are perhaps one of the most important military capabilities on the battlefield in Ukraine. But instead of being the size of a Cessna, they're the size of a coffee table sort of thing, and doing the same sort of job. And the quantity, tens and tens of thousands. The figure that I find very compelling on the drone side is that virtually every artillery round fired by the Ukrainian side has a drone the other end spotting for it and redirecting the fire. So in fact, artillery that traditionally is not a precision weapon is being turned into a precision weapon by these drones. So I can't remember the exact cost, whatever it is, 1.2 billion we're spending on Watchkeeper for 50 drones. I think I agree with the tone of Gareth's piece, and I suppose I should do, because we had a long chat about it, that this needs to be looked at, because whether a big, slow, and these things only go about 70 miles an hour and 20,000 feet, whether it is what to be done. And without wanting to cover any of the ground you covered yesterday, I think the whole air defense thing is critical here. Interesting to note that the Russians are only shooting down about 50% of drones, particularly those ones going towards Moscow, where Ukraine's now up to 80-90%. So I think the dynamic has changed. The challenge is that military procurement takes so long to catch up. What Ukraine is able to do, of course, is to buy off the shelf and also be supplied by NATO and all the rest of it. That's something that British military procurement has found it very, very difficult to do. The Defence Review refresh that has just been published, of course, talks a lot about drones, but whether we are going to be able to learn effectively those lessons and have an impact, who knows? But I personally think that Watchkeeper is going to be challenged in a war-fighting context that we're seeing. And when we say war-fighting, fighting between two sides, states, as it were, with everything involved, tanks, aircraft, artillery, etc., what its utility is going to be, sure, for counterinsurgency and policing, it has a role to play. But, it needs a lot of thought, I think, on this one.
Thanks, Hamish. Yesterday, I spoke to... Well, the interview went yesterday with Christopher Miller from the FT, and he spoke about how the exchanges now between, for example, the British Army and the Ukrainian Army in terms of training actually start to go both ways. That, of course, the Brits and other NATO allies are training the Ukrainians to do certain things, but they're actually learning quite a lot from the Ukrainians as well. It's very much a relationship of equals, which I thought was a very interesting point. I mean, I'd ask both of you, do you think that the use of drone warfare and the way that the Ukrainian defence of their country and how they pioneered that and experimented with that is a good example of that? And also, what surprised you about how they employ drones?
Oh, well, Hamish here. Well, let me go first. I think absolutely. Fairly early on in the war, I was asked what advice I could give to tank commanders in Ukraine, and I said pretty much none. It would be absolutely the other way round. So I think in the early days, and what we have been doing, the British military, training Ukraine in the basic way to fight, the art of fighting at the low level. But the way that they have been so flexible and the test and adjust, as it were, in the use of these things, we have an incredible amount to learn, I think. And the number of these drones being used, I just think that command and control, that's where you have battalion and company and platoon sort of commanders trying to control all the various assets that they have. If you've only got one Watchkeeper drone out there working for you, the control of it's quite easy. If you have got 5,000 smaller drones controlling that, making sure that they're not all doing the same thing, is very complex. And I think that is something that we really need to learn. I know the British military and the procurement of it gets a real kicking, but there are a lot of really bright men and women in the British military who are looking at these things. There's a lot of sort of conferences and research going on to make sure that we absolutely learn the right lessons coming out of Ukraine. And if you could, the amount of fighting that they are doing or have done is phenomenal. In my 25-year career in the British military, I deployed on, I think, 11 operational tours, but in the sum of it would not add up to the sort of 14 months of a tank battalion commander in Ukraine in experience, if that doesn't make sense. So to me, it's the way that they are using it in the intelligence surveillance piece, getting all the information, target acquisition, in other words, finding those targets and being able to prosecute those targets, in other words, put some fire down on it accurately, to me is really a change. And what one just hopes, if money was no object, of course, we'd be changing our military all the time to reflect what we're learning. But life's just not as simple as that. But but also it's good for now. What we must keep doing is keep evolving, because the next conflict, no doubt, will be slightly different. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Dom, I know you've got some thoughts on this as well.
I would just add on the comment Hamish made a little earlier on about COTS, so commercial off the shelf. I think one of the lessons that's coming out of the war in Ukraine, especially through the lens of the drone warfare, is how COTS, or the military procurement systems more broadly, are really being examined now. So, as Hamish said, a lot of these things are COTS, commercial off the shelf, as in you can just go and buy them down the shops kind of thing. And that's absolutely fine. That is a perfectly valid and legitimate military procurement strategy. A country can go to the open market and buy stuff. Now, you have to understand that the country that manufactures these things, be it tank, jet fighters, submarines, what have you, they're not going to sell their Premier League kit. So commercial off the shelf, you could get some very, very, very capable military capability stuff, but it's not going to be the best possible stuff in the market or not in the market, but in the world at that time. So you better hope if you go for a COTS strategy, which you save all your kind of investment in research and development, what have you, just buy your money goes straight to the stuff on the shelf. But you better hope that your enemy hasn't got anything slightly better, because otherwise you're matched. And so COTS is a very valid strategy, but it does have drawbacks, as opposed to designing something yourself, breaking physics, coming up with something absolutely brand new that is unrivaled anywhere in the world. Now, put that together with the recent report from RUSI, the think tank here in London, Royal United Services Institute, that said at its peak, Ukraine are losing 10,000 drones a month. I mean, a staggering, phenomenal, staggering figure. They can do that. They are, I wouldn't say happy, but they are content to do that, to lose things, to use them and lose them, knowing that so many of them are going to be either shot down or come down because of electronic warfare or what have you. But if they are cheap and cheerful and people are sending them, they are buying them, they are COTS, then that might work. So the question you have to ask is, what is the special sauce that goes into the thing that you are developing? We're talking about Watchkeeper here. Look at the numbers. Hamish said, I think, what was it, 1.2 billion for a program that's going to produce 50 odd airframes. So that had better be pretty blooming special to make that investment and the time worth it. Because I mean, I don't know what the special sauce is with Watchkeeper. Maybe it's more than just eyes and ears in the sky. Maybe it's a synthetic aperture radar, something like that. You can see through cloud and so on and so forth. But my question is, and Gareth and I were chatting about this yesterday, if you went for in something like drones, that when you just wanted to see stuff and be able to call in artillery fire or any other kind of cue another part of the military machine, do you lose by not going for the special sauce? Do you lose more than you gain by just having thousands of these things that you can use and you can spread about, and the training burden is tiny because you just lob them in the air and drive them like a remote control? Well, they are literally a remote controlled device. So in an area like drones, I wonder if we are seeing how warfare, peer on peer, major state on state warfare, not when we're in a counterinsurgency campaign when the sky is our own type thing, but you are in a peer on peer conflict. I just wonder if this war has shown that something like drones, you really have to think very, very carefully about investing huge sums of money in very long programs that take a long time to turn up and may well be out of date by the time they arrive, vice just having thousands of bits and pieces to go right now. I mean, a question to be discussed at length. But what's a military there to do? It's to be combat effective and as lethal as it can. And I just wonder if by having thousands of cheap and cheerful drones that are COTS and I accept is as good as the thing that the enemy could buy, are you going to be more effective and more lethal because you can get more of them into the hands of more men and women, creating death and destruction on the enemy, than going for a very small number of exquisite pieces of kit that take a long time to arrive but may have some super duper special part to it? Question, I don't know. That's a live discussion. Gareth and I were having it yesterday. It's one for the public. It will roll on, but I think that's one of the most salient lessons that have come out of this war for me.
Thanks, Dom and Hamish. Can I go back to Gareth? Let's go back to the drone war in Ukraine. Can you talk about some of the research you've seen recently about some of the new things that you've seen emerging there?
Yes, absolutely. So moving along from Watchkeeper, but still on the related topic of drone warfare, as both Dom and Hamish have just discussed at length now, we're seeing an extensive use of commercial off-the-shelf COTS drones. We're also seeing two different strands here. We're seeing an increasing shift towards what you might call DIY drones, which are 3D printed components. And anywhere you can set up a 3D printer, which is the space of a desktop, a table, kitchen table, for example. You can then print replacement parts for damaged drones and bring them back in the servers. You can print the major components, which you can mate to the high-tech bits, the motors and guidance systems and so on, which can be brought up to the front lines by existing logistic trains. You can do all kinds of very interesting things, which mean you can deploy drones much faster to the front line, but also to an extent lessens your dependence even on the open market when it comes to these COTS drones. And the other interesting thing we've seen, it's a bit of research pulled together by a chap I know called Matt Moss. He runs a blog called The Armourer's Bench. Matt's a sort of general sort of small arms, he won't mind me saying this, bit of a small arms geek. And he has put together some very interesting stuff, which is culled from footage, live footage from some of these first-person view drones, the ones with cameras mounted on them, which indicates that we're starting to see a kind of First World War-style aerial combat, drone-on-drone emerging. Now, the conceptual evolution is pretty simple. Both sides, as both Dom and Hamish have discussed here, are using drones extensively as aerial reconnaissance platforms. They're using them to see over that hill or that building in front to get eyes on for supporting artillery strikes and so on and so forth. But of course, the other side are doing exactly the same thing. And the question has arisen already, what do you do if you're a drone operator or you're on the ground operating a drone and you see an enemy drone coming up? Well, of course, you do your best to try and take out the enemy drone. So we're seeing now the emergence of some very interesting videos showing drone-on-drone aerial smashes. We're seeing drone operators trying to tip over on enemy drones. We're looking at them bouncing on them from height and smacking into them in the hope of destroying rotors or damaging key systems. Have to flip the thing over and send it hurtling back to the earth. And these engagements actually have strong historical parallels, as Mr. Moss points out, with the First World War. The sort of dawn of aerial warfare came about with exactly the same sort of thing going on. Early aircraft being used for aerial recce, for that sort of artillery spotting mission. And then, of course, the pilots and observers in those aeroplanes would see enemy observers and they would say, well, what can we do about it? And the evolution of that was first they began carrying rifles and pistols and machine guns. Then they began strapping the machine guns to the aeroplanes. Then new aeroplanes were built with the machine guns integrated into the design. And then many decades later, we started putting guided missiles on the aeroplanes. So we may be at the dawn of a sort of history repeating itself almost, to slightly mix the metaphor there, as we see drone-on-drone warfare becoming an emerging theme or an emerging topic. But of course, returning back to the Watchkeeper story very briefly, we're not going to see that happening with Watchkeeper anytime soon because, of course, the thing is not only unarmed, but as a $1.35 billion defence programme, I also revealed that it is still not cleared to fly in inclement weather. That is, it is a visual meteorological conditions only. So provided it's not cloudy and not raining, you can fly it. But that's not a consideration which should affect the sort of small homemade DIY drones, the FPV drones, or indeed the drones which are now being used to smack into each other in the hope of knocking the enemy's opposing eyes out of the sky, as it were, David.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Hamish, to Breton, Gordon. Hamish, you wanted to speak a little bit about Dmitry Medvedev today. What have you been reflecting on?
Yes, Medvedev. There was a very good piece in the paper today, I think it by Svetlana Moretz, talking about Medvedev's latest sort of outburst, saying that if the counteroffensive was successful, the Ukraine counteroffensive, Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. And the theme of her piece is actually that the world knows that Putin's too scared to use nuclear weapons. Now, Medvedev this is the 60th time he has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. So I hadn't realised that he had a propaganda role. And he has had a heck of a fall from grace. He was Prime Minister not so long ago, and now he's Deputy Head of the Security Council. And his liking of vodka is well known. And if you read any of his tweets, particularly about the nuclear piece, you'd have thought that he's had quite a lot of that vodka. But he sort of goes on to say that, and I think the assumption is that he is suggesting that the conventional warfare that Russia is using is failing and not being a success, and thinks that by threatening nuclear, that is going to, by some way, make the West withdraw and make Ukraine stop fighting. But really, from the get-go, it's had the exact opposite effect that I think everybody has agreed. And I wrote a paper for the American government last year about this, that actually there is no way that Russia would go nuclear Armageddon, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Certainly Medvedev would never be in that fire chain. When it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, which is what he's talking about here, These are the smaller battlefield ones that presumably he wants to drop on Crimea if they lost Crimea. Well, there was a lot of talk coming from him that they'd move some to Belarus so that they'd be in range. I'm pretty sceptical if those tactical nukes ever reach Belarus. And even if they did, the firing chain, the sequence that would need to go through, one can get from open source comments from US and UK intelligence in particular, that these things have been very, very carefully looked at. And I'm sure that they would be interdicted and unable to fire. I think in his propaganda role, propaganda has, which Russia are experts at, well, experts in quantity, perhaps rather than quality, but it's got to be plausible. But generally what he says, and particularly in the tone he says it in his tweets and elsewhere, just leads him to be completely implausible and really just some drunk ranting in the dark. So if I was Putin, I would blame him for really destroying one of my trump cards, because exactly as Varna's piece says, we all know that Putin can't go nuclear. So when his out of control attack dog starts talking about it, most of us have a bit of a chuckle. So I think her piece is excellent, and it really again underwrites that the Russians have nowhere to go apart from throwing more quantity into the meat grinder. And I know how terrified people are on the nuclear piece. I do an awful lot of briefings for foreign companies and others who have people in Ukraine, and also to people, civilians in Ukraine, first of all, telling them what to do if, in the event, which I'm saying is not going to happen, does happen, so that they can survive. But more importantly, trying to reassure people that rantings from people like Medvedev are completely hollow and without substance.
Thank you very much for that, Hamish. Hamish, I don't know if you're yet on one of the sort of sanctioned lists from the Russian Foreign Ministry, but I definitely check your name on that list next time, mate. But thank you very much for that. Dom, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. Right, I've been I'm watching the old grain issue, not the grain deal, but Russia's very obvious attack on grain facilities. I think this is an interesting and new side to the war that we've not really seen before. And let me explain this. So, to my thinking, what Russia does with disinformation, or to try to shout down opponents and all that kind of stuff, is the classic divert, deny, discredit the information. Now, on discredit, they discredit the source of the information. We saw that earlier on today when I was mentioning Belarus, talking about Poland changing its story after getting its orders from its masters. I mean, it's just stupid, but they just discredit the source. We get hit by trolls, journalists, not just us, but loads of people get hit by trolls. It just they try to discredit the source, or they just deny it. We had Verity earlier on talking about the reports of torture. Well, all Russia do is just say, no, we didn't. And that's it. I mean, they've refused to engage even when faced with most compelling evidence and, dare I say it, facts. But so they just deny. They'll also divert. So you may remember some months ago, I was quite rightly had to present myself yellow pages down the back of the trousers in front of Artis Pabriks, the former Latvian defence minister, when he gave me a bit of a spanking for using the phrase legitimate targets. I was saying the training of Ukrainian troops in Britain and elsewhere, does that mean that we're legitimate targets? And he quite rightly said, look, there's no legitimate targets here. This whole war is illegal, immoral, unjustified. It's totally illegitimate. It's the wrong framing to talk about legitimate targets, and he was absolutely correct. But just for a moment, let me dip my toe into that world. When it comes to attacks on the energy infrastructure, Russia would divert the criticism, saying, well, that directly leads to Ukrainian strength on the battlefield, therefore we can hit it. It's a legitimate target. We're going to hit the energy infrastructure. We're not attacking civilians. We are attacking Ukraine's war machine. So they will divert the argument there. And then you come on to grain. And the Black Sea deal, you can get bent around the axle about the politics of it and who's adhering to which clause and subclause this and blah, blah, blah. But the destruction of the grain silos, you can't divert that. You can't say, it's leading to an increase in Ukrainian combat capability. They can't say that. They can't deny it's happening because it just is, and we can see it. And they can't discredit the myriad channels through which this news is reaching us. So unlike all the other areas of this war where Russia have an answer, as half-assed as it is, they'll have an answer. They've got no answer to this. How do they look the world in the face, in the UN, the global south, anybody, and justify attacking the grain silos and the grain infrastructure and what they're doing here for food? So we've not yet had any. I mean, they obviously won't volunteer this. They won't, because they know they can't. They won't volunteer this information. And I've yet to see anyone really put it to them. I'm not going to get on my hobby horse again about the UN. Don't worry, I've just had a nice holiday. I'm not going to get all wrapped up on that just yet. Be another few weeks before I start ranting about the UN. But who is going to put this to Russia? Why are you attacking the grain infrastructure? Explain to us the logic behind that. And unlike all the others, as I said before, this is the first time in this war I think Russia really will not be able to justify it, which is why they are silent on the subject. But I welcome and I look forward to any comment from Russia just to show up the utter sham of their position and the war more generally. So keep an eye out. Well, keep an eye out for silence, I would suggest.
Thank you very much, Dom. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, would you like to finish today?
Thank you. I'd just like to finish on the African leaders' peace deal, which was buzzing around yesterday. And if you covered it, I apologise. But I had a look at it, and it's slightly related to the grain as well, because it's that grain that is supposedly going to Africa to feed people, the poorest in the world. But on the African leaders' peace deal seems to me have been written by Putin. There are three key tenets to it, and I am oversimplifying it. The first bit would be withdrawal of Russian troops. Now, it doesn't really go into detail, but withdrawal of Russian troops to 2014 lines, interesting. The second bit is the removal of Russian nuclear weapons from Belarus. Well, if you believe me, there aren't any there anyway. And the third element is the dropping of the indictment of Putin at the International Criminal Court. And that really stuck something in me. I hadn't really considered that Putin was that worried about it, but he obviously is, and he said that he supports this peace deal. So if the way I look at it, that the African leaders' peace deal is that Russian troops withdraw to 2014 positions, nuclear weapons go out of Belarus, and the indictment of Putin is dropped, it seems to me the key tenet here is the indictment of Putin. And that makes me feel better that he really sees that as a major thing. And I think there are many more indictments for him to come. But I think it's something one will look at as things move on. I don't think there's a snowball selling chance that the Ukrainian, unless the Russians do withdraw to 2014 positions, which is the key thing that President Zelensky is that's his key objective for any sort of peace deal. But the fact that Putin actually doesn't want to go to the International Criminal Court gives me a little bit of hope.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.